Hello, and welcome to all you PMOs, PMEs, POMOs, POMEs, and PIMQs. Welcome to The World, the podcast where we discuss all things related to the process of waking up, walking out, and moving on from life as a Jehovah's Witness. I'm Dr. Ryan Lee, a former JW with a doctorate in clinical psychology and a practicing therapist specializing in helping former JWs and other former cult members move through the recovery and rebuilding process. I just wanted to insert a couple of quick announcements. Number one is I have been doing this twice a week, and I am realizing that is an unsustainable pace for me. So we're going to be switching to doing this once a week, and we'll be putting out a new episode every Monday. All right, so the subject of today's episode is boundaries. What the fuck is that? To most ex-JWs, especially those fresh out of the organization, the idea of boundaries is a completely foreign concept. And this is because within the organization, there really isn't such a thing as boundaries. You know, when you're asked to take on more responsibilities in the organization, the idea of saying, "No, I'm not really interested," is unthinkable. When an elder approaches you and expresses the opinion that you need to do more in service or improve your attendance, you have to have like a special kind of nerve to say, "Actually, I feel pretty good about my performance and I'm not really interested in doing more." So I'm making myself laugh as I give this imaginary scenario because even 25 years out of the organization, there's still a feeling of like, oh, that's not something you can say. But it totally is something you can say. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. But before we go into that, let me just point out a couple other areas where there's really no boundaries. So for example, social boundaries. That's not even a thing. Everybody has to be friends with everybody, You have very little choice about who you want to spend time with. And to exclude anyone because you find their energy intolerable is seen as selfish, uncaring, you're seen as a bad person. And so the only thing to do is to be fake as hell, pretending to like somebody that you don't while they slowly suck your soul. And you're creating a situation that would be a nightmare for most people, meaning, that we're sharing something with someone who's only patronizing us out of some misplaced sense of pity. But the lack of boundaries goes even deeper than that. There's this culture in the organization that kind of presumes that everyone else deserves to have access to all of your deepest desires and feelings and thoughts, and that simply choosing not to share one thing or another has this insinuation that you're hiding something. And if you're hiding something, therefore, you're essentially being dishonest, if you don't confess every little sin or indiscretion or random thought you have. And this is amplified by the idea that Jehovah sees everything and will make sure that the truth will always be discovered and come to light. His big brother is always watching. And so for a lot of people, it puts us in a state where we're just constantly confessing everything because as uncomfortable as that is, it doesn't seem as scary as being found out, And also part of the culture is that being seen as nice is always the most important thing. Never want to do anything that might cause anyone even the slightest bit of discomfort, But here's the thing. More often than not, setting boundaries involves saying no in some form, which nobody likes to hear. So, in turn, setting boundaries almost inevitably involves accepting that you'll make somebody else uncomfortable, which makes us really uncomfortable. So altogether, this is just one more way the organization has counter-prepared us for life on the outside. I specifically use counter-prepared as opposed to underprepared or unprepared, because not only have we not been taught how to have healthy boundaries, but we've been programmed that there's something inherently wrong or bad about setting boundaries. We've been programmed to be averse to the thing that is healthy. So yeah, counter-prepared seems like a much better word. So learning what boundaries are and practicing setting them is one of the most fundamental tasks for living a fulfilling life and also just for really loving yourself. So let's start out by defining what boundaries are. In broad terms, boundaries are the limits or rules that we set to define acceptable behavior, protect our well-being, and maintain healthy relationships. They help us communicate our needs, our values, our personal space. They can be physical, emotional, mental, and we'll even touch on digital. So let's elaborate a little bit on these. So physical boundaries. When we're talking about physical boundaries, we're talking about our comfort level with personal space, physical touch, privacy. For example, some people just aren't huggers. I myself love me a good, long, awkwardly long bear hug. But that's not everyone. And sure, sometimes when people aren't huggers, it's because maybe they had some negative experience that made them uncomfortable with touch. But other times it's just how a person is. And that's just what their comfort level is. And this is such an important point because you don't need to explain your boundaries to anyone or even yourself. It's simply enough just knowing what you do and don't like and choosing to be around people who can respect that, regardless of your reasons. So then there are emotional boundaries. These involve your feelings and how other people treat your feelings. It means protecting your emotions by not letting others manipulate, criticize, or invalidate your feelings. All of these are tools used by the organization and people in it to coerce you into doing things that are against your better interests. There are mental boundaries. Mental boundaries are related to your thoughts, your beliefs, your opinions. Mental boundaries are what allow you to have your own perspective without feeling pressured to agree with everybody. Obviously this is a huge one for ex-JWs witnesses. We don't all have to agree. We don't. It's okay. It's fundamental for us to disagree. And if someone has feelings or is really wound up because you disagree with them on something, that is their issue, not your problem. That's their issue. Being a human being at a fundamental sense is having your own perspective, having your own opinions, seeing things the way you see them. And it's for each of us to grow in our own ability to tolerate and accept that other people aren't going to see it that way. Okay, moving on. So there's time boundaries. Time boundaries involve how you spend your time and how much time you're willing to give to others. Setting time boundaries might mean saying no to certain activities or prioritizing self-care or other responsibilities over things that other people want you to do. Again, non-existent in the organization. There's material boundaries. These pertain to your belongings and how they're being used by others. For example, you might set boundaries about lending items like money or clothes or your car. We're going to talk a little bit more about those things later, about how to set really clear boundaries, because most of us have feelings, whether we like to admit it or not, on how soon someone is going to pay back that $10,000 loan you gave them, And then, of course, there's this whole new area of digital boundaries. These relate to how you engage with others online, how much information you share, how responsive you are to texts. These are all things you're allowed to have preferences for and assert what your boundaries are in relation to them. I'm sure there are so many other examples, but the bottom line is that these are all areas that you have every right to choose and enforce, regardless of whether other people approve or validate them. I want you to hear this, okay? It is okay to choose things that feel good and to protect yourself from things that do not. I'm going to say it one more time. It is okay to choose things that feel good and to protect yourself from things that do not. Period. Okay, so why are boundaries important? There's a few reasons. First of all, self-care. Boundaries help you take care of yourself by ensuring your needs and limits are respected. There's this mentality with the Jehovah's Witnesses about just like lavishing so much praise and adoration for people who are so selfless and just always say yes, and they're just constantly giving. And don't get me wrong, I'm not a Scrooge here. There's so much beauty in giving. Really, it's a beautiful thing. But the extent to which they go to, it's not a healthy thing. It's not. And here's the reason, and we'll talk about this in another episode, but like our energy is finite. We don't really think about that very much, but our time and our energy is finite. We only have so much to give. And part of that energy and part of that time needs to go to taking care of ourselves. Now, I think that's a beautiful endeavor on its own. And again, another podcast on selfishness and renegotiating our relationship with that. But even from a practical standpoint, if you are not filling your own cup, if you are depleting your own energy, if you are saying yes when you mean no, and giving when really you don't really have enough for yourself, this is a recipe for disaster. Even if your goal is to help other people, you're not going to be much good to them if your tank is empty and you're running on fumes. Making a difference and helping people is not about giving everything you have all of the time. Anybody that actually makes an impact, you'll look at that person and you'll realize they actually have some really good self-care habits and really good boundaries, that they protect themselves, they protect their energy so they can continue doing this work that demands a lot of them. Okay, so what else? Why are boundaries important? They're essential for healthy relationships. They prevent relationships from becoming unhealthy or codependent by ensuring mutual respect. Having good boundaries means that we're clear about what our needs and expectations are, so we don't have to go about getting our needs met with more sideways, manipulative kind of behavior. When we have clear boundaries, we don't have to worry about those unspoken contracts that we signed unwittingly, where someone does something nice for you, only to find out that they're expecting you to return their favor at a time of their choosing, and, these kind of covert agreements. They're a recipe for disaster in relationships. Healthy boundaries are a fundamental aspect of healthy relationships. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about a framework for how to set boundaries. In part 2 of this episode, we're going to dive in and elaborate on all the things discussed in this episode. But before we wrap up today, let me just leave you with a framework for thinking about how to create and enforce boundaries. First off, identify your own limits. Be curious and learn about what makes you uncomfortable, what makes you comfortable. If you feel inclined, sure, you might reflect a little bit on why you feel this way or that, but don't let the desire for an explanation or justification get in the way of the most important part. If it does or does not feel good, whatever the reason, that is enough for you to create a boundary around it. Number 2, communicate clearly. Express your boundaries as concisely and directly as possible. Ideally, without being aggressive, but there are situations that actually call for that, and we'll touch a little more on that in the second part of this episode. Number 3, be consistent. This is sometimes the hardest part with people because it takes so much of our energy to summon the courage to just say something simple like, it makes me uncomfortable when you do that. It's a lot of energy and a lot of work. And we want it to just be done with. But here's the thing, it just doesn't work that way. We really need to reinforce our boundaries consistently and repeat them as many times as necessary to ensure that they're respected. When you're surrounded by people who have a vested interest in not respecting your boundaries, Jehovah's Witnesses, it is rarely a one-and-done situation because they will test you. They will try to locate any possible weakness in your resolve to get what they want out of the situation. And also, and this is really important, the best way to reinforce behavior that you don't like is to be inconsistent with how you hold your boundaries in relation to it. I'm going to take a quick detour here and talk about something called intermittent reinforcement. Intermittent reinforcement is a concept in behavioral psychology. And as the name implies, behavioral psychology is concerned about how to affect certain kinds of behavior in people or animals. And basically, the only surefire way to produce a reliably consistent change in behavior or to extinguish an undesirable behavior is to provide continuous reinforcement. In other words, once we set a boundary, we stand by it, we reinforce it as many times as necessary until we see the change we want. Now, conversely, there is intermittent reinforcement. And that means that sometimes we hold a boundary that we set, and other times we let people push right past it without a fight. So maybe we set a boundary with our relatives that we're not interested in hearing them preach to us, and we don't want to talk about that. We're not open to that. But most of the time we keep that up, and maybe 1 out of every 5 times we don't have the energy. We're just like, fine, tell me more about Jehovah. This is inconsistent or intermittent reinforcement. Now, if we set a boundary while using intermittent reinforcement, this is a surefire way of ensuring that the behavior will continue, because this sort of pattern lights up our reward centers. For whatever reason, we're wired this way, but we intuitively know that a certain pattern of behavior will get us what we want 1 out of 3, 1 out of 5, 1 out of 10 times, and a switch goes off in us to pursue that course of action even more aggressively, because it is so gratifying when that 1 in 10 pays off. This is how gambling works. They even have this thing at casinos where they track your activity with a card. They're watching what you're playing and how much you're losing. And if they see that you're on a steady losing streak, they'll send someone out to comp you like $50 or a night at the hotel, because they know that $50 in your mind will count as a gratifying win. And that gratifying win, no matter how small or petty, will keep you going as you pour another $1,000 down the drain, So anyways, this is all just to reinforce the idea that if you're not consistent with these boundaries that you set, unyielding, you're creating a situation where actually the behavior you don't like is much more likely to continue. Okay, getting back to our list on how to set boundaries. Number 4, practice self-awareness. Be aware of your feelings and when your boundaries need to be adjusted. Often we don't know we have a boundary until it's been crossed, and we'll feel it. You'll feel it in your body. Something's off here, and we'll talk a little later about how to handle those situations in real time. But, just pay attention, to how these things make you feel and use that as a benchmark for how you create boundaries. Now, conversely, it's also worth mentioning as we're practicing self-awareness with our boundaries, that sometimes we're holding onto a boundary that served us in the past but is no longer needed in this situation. So this happens a lot in relationships where we may be with a narcissistic or abusive partner, and as a result, we have to create very, very, very strong boundaries to protect ourselves, which is super important. But then we move on to a much healthier relationship with a partner that doesn't require such sharp or loud boundaries in order to respect you. And we find these old ways of relating are actually inhibiting the intimacy that we crave. So yeah, practice self-awareness. Keep tuning in all day, every day. How is this making me feel? What do I need out of this situation? And revisiting whether the boundaries that we have in place are still serving us. Okay, and finally, number 5 is, by all means, please practice what you are preaching and respect other people's boundaries. Just as you set your boundaries, be mindful and respectful of the boundaries that other people set for themselves. If you're dealing with a relatively healthy person, this is pretty straightforward. They'll tell you what they do or do not like, and your job is simply to respect that. Do not ridicule or invalidate them for having that boundary. Don't try to explain why they shouldn't have that boundary. And also, you don't have to make a big thing out of it. You know what I mean? Like falling all over yourself to apologize and overly fawning on them because you stepped across a line that you didn't even know was there. It doesn't have to be a big thing. Just a simple, oh, okay, thanks for letting me know. I hear you. Anyways, and then let the interaction progress from there. Okay, so that wraps up part 1 of this episode. This one's pretty juicy, I think. I hope you all found it very helpful. And if you did, pretty please, could you hit the subscribe button and leave us a review? And pay it forward by sharing this podcast with other people who might benefit. If you have any questions, feedback, or ideas for future topics, email me at drryanlee@drryanlee.com or visit my website at drryanlee.com. Until next time, remember, you are brave. You are strong. You are totally capable of setting boundaries. And you, my friend, are not alone.